scary things about American politics is what Republicans are doing. Are democracies providing the rope to hang themselves? From Turkey to Hungary, from India to the United States, authoritarian leaders have gained power under the protective cloak of free elections. There is no doubt that democratic processes and judicial decisions can be used to limit the power of the people, restructuring governments and institutions to make them less representative, more undemocratic, Roger Smith, a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania told me, in response to my emailed inquiry. Smith continued. The classic examples are partisan gerrymandering and barriers to voting, but in recent years Republicans have gone further than ever before in using their overrepresentation in state legislatures to shift power to those legislatures, away from officeholders in Democratic-led cities, from officials elected statewide and from voters. Jack Goldstone, a professor of public policy at George Mason University, made a parallel argument by email. One of the odd and scary things about American politics, more reminiscent of the 19th century than anything in the post-World War II period, is that when the Republicans lost the presidential election in 2020 and did much worse than expected in 2022, even worse than in a normal midterm contest, they did not abandon the leaders and policies that produced these results. Instead, they have doubled down on even more extreme and broadly unpopular leaders and policies, from Trump to abortion and guns. Goldstone believes that this development is a sign that normal politics have been replaced by extreme polarization and factional identity politics, in which the extremes grow stronger and drain the center. As a minority seeking to exercise control of government, it is actually necessary that the Trumpist GOP suppress democratic procedures that normally produce majority control. If enough voters, Goldstone wrote, are deeply anxious or frightened of some real or imagined threat, e.g. socialism, mass immigration, crime, threats to their religion, transgender takeover, they may well vote for someone who promises to stand up to those threats, even if that person has no regard for preserving democracy, no regard for the rights and freedoms of those seen as enemies. If such a leader is elected, gets his or her party to control all parts of government, and wants to turn all the elements of government into a weapon to attack their enemies, no laws or other organizations can stop them. Goldstone warned that should the Republicans manage to gain control of the House, Senate and presidency in 2024, building an electoral autocracy to impose their views without challenge will be their top priority. There are two distinct mechanisms involved in overturning democracy, Goldstone argued. First, is controlling all elected and appointed elements of the government. If the same political party controls the House, Senate, judiciary and presidency, and disregards the principles of democracy and independence of officials, then sadly none of the institutions of democracy will prevent arbitrary and autocratic government. The second element, according to Goldstone, is unique to this country. The United States has so many safeguards for minority rights that it is conceivable that a minority party could obtain complete control of all levers of government. How so? The U.S. Senate is chosen on the basis of territory, not numbers, so that Wyoming and California both have 2 senators. Gerrymanders mean that states where Democratic and Republican voters are about even, like Wisconsin and North Carolina, have very unequal representation in Congress. Finally, the Electoral College method of aggregating state votes for president has meant that in 2000 and 2016 candidates with a minority of the people's votes were elected. The consequences? A determined effort to twist and benefit from these various opportunities and rules means that a party that represents a minority of the people can, in the U.S., control the House, Senate, and presidency, Goldstone wrote, enabling an oppressive government restricting freedom and ruling autocratically, and doing so to impose the goals and beliefs of a minority on an unwilling majority. Robert Lieberman, a political scientist at Johns Hopkins and a co-author, with Suzanne Medler, a political scientist at Cornell, of For Threats, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy, argued in an email that democratic procedure is not a threat to democracy per se, but it is fair to say that it has vulnerabilities. Democratic procedures, he continued, are intended to provide a means to hold leaders accountable, which include horizontal accountability, institutional checks and balances that enable public officials to hold each other accountable, and vertical accountability, ways for citizens to hold public officials accountable, such as elections or popular mobilization. In a well-functioning democracy, both kinds of accountability work together to limit the concentration of power in the hands of a single party or individual. But Lieberman pointed out, democratic procedures can also enable would-be authoritarians to undermine both kinds of accountability under the cloak of democratic legitimacy. Democratic regimes, he wrote, are less likely than in the past to be overthrown in a sudden violent burst, as in an overt coup d'état. Instead, democracies are more frequently degraded by leaders who use apparently legal, democratic means to hollow out democratic accountability. Voter suppression or gerrymandering, Lieberman noted, can limit vertical accountability by making it harder for the opposition to win elections, while maneuvers such as court packing can lower barriers for a party in power to expand its power. And these kind of tactics can reinforce one another, as when the Supreme Court upheld the practice of partisan gerrymandering, in Rucho v. Common Cause. Taken together, these kinds of moves can enable a party to gain and keep power without majority support and increasingly unconstrained by public disapproval. One of the odd and scary things about American politics is what Republicans are doing. Are democracies providing the rope to hang themselves? From Turkey to Hungary, from India to the United States, authoritarian leaders have gained power under the protective cloak of free elections. There is no doubt that democratic processes and judicial decisions can be used to limit the power of the people, restructuring governments and institutions to make them less